So next on the agenda is the Prospect Ridge presentation. And we have with us David Goldenberg from the Affordable Housing Committee. Thanks for being here. And Mr. Frank Coyle from the Ridgefield Housing Authority. Good evening, Frank. Thanks for hanging in there.
Hi, Rudy.
So I'll turn it over to David if we can move through this. As you know, it's 8 o'clock now, so thank you for your time consideration.
Well, thanks for inviting us here. I have a presentation actually to give you, and it's been updated somewhat since the draft you received last week. But the origin of it is that we started a process about 8 years ago, actually, of looking at the land adjacent to the current Prospect Ridge affordable housing behind the playing fields for additional affordable housing. For various reasons that did not move forward at the time, but it seemed to us that now was an opportune time to move forward with this. So I reached out to Frank Coyle, chair of the Housing Authority, to ask if he was interested. And he said yes. 8 years ago, the Housing Authority was really not in a position to take this on. But at this time, Frank and the Housing Authority were more than interested. So we've been holding a number of meetings, doing a lot of research, and I just want to give you an overview. And ultimately, what we want from you is your approval to move on to the next step, which I'll describe in a few minutes. So let me share my screen here. This will just take a moment to set it up. Are you looking at the title page?
Yes.
We are, yeah.
I like when that happens. Okay, here we go. So first, let's just talk a little bit about what's available and what the perceived need is. And we're going to talk a little bit about need. We're in the process now of beginning a pretty thorough study of need, but for various reasons, that's something that cannot be completed until next year. So we're going to look at the information that we have. First of all, there are now 152 Housing Authority owned units. There are 60 Ballard Green subsidized units, 38 affordable units, 34 congregate subsidized, and 20 family units at the Meadows. Here's the waiting list, and this is pretty startling. There's 129 names on the list for the 60 units. There are 265 names on the list for the general affordable unit. There are 76 waiting for the congregate subsidized, and there are 140 names on the family Meadows. Many people will wait years, and there's a high level of attrition on this as well. So the list gets smaller and it gets larger over time, but we will never be able to meet the need we have with the housing that we have. The trends at this time encourage affordable multifamily housing. This really surprised me when I showed it. In 1970, the lowest line you see on the left there represents people who are age 55 and over. And look what's happened over time. We've gone from being the smallest cohort in town to the largest cohort at the moment, and that's going to be that way for the foreseeable future. However, the housing in town is really designed around housing families with children. Aging baby boomers continue to need housing, and that's one reason that housing for older people tends to move very quickly. Another reason is that lower income households never really recovered from the recession. And what this chart shows is that poverty has remained flat since 2007. And what's called ALICE, asset limited, income constrained employed, that is people working full time but not earning a lot of money, that number increased dramatically with the recession and has never decreased over time. So they're working with fewer resources. And finally, if you look at ALICE, and if you look at poverty, about 22% of Ridgefielders fall into that category. Now that's lower than some communities in the area, but higher than others. The Prospect Ridge campus, as it exists, there are 34 congregate units, and those were within the larger of the two areas that are marked here. 20 general affordable, and On the left, that smaller parcel is the 20 family units of the Meadows, which was constructed in 2009. That originated in the Affordable Housing Committee and was taken over by the Housing Authority. So there are 74 total units there. Here's the proposed expansion area. In the upper left, you see the existing campus. There are two parcels that belong to the town. One of them contains the ball field and one of them contains the soccer field. And what we are proposing is to utilize this area here. It is approximately 15 acres. It includes parts of those two parcels plus part of the existing parcel.
Dave, is it in the red? Is that what it is?
Yes, it's the red, sorry.
Okay.
That's approximately 15 acres. We estimate it could contain up to 150 units. Will that be what we propose to build? We don't know, and you'll see how we're going to figure that out in a few minutes. There are steep contours, there are wetlands, and this reduces the buildable area.
Yeah.
Our goal is to leave the dog park and the playing fields untouched. There are three possible avenues of ingress: through Halpin Lane, through Prospect Ridge, through Ivy Hill, but access is to be determined. And importantly, this would require a land swap with Parks and Rec. So in 2012, the Affordable Housing Committee proposed building in the area circled in red at the Danbury Road Parks and Rec campus. The Parks and Recreation Commission said, well, we would like to hold on to that land for future potential recreational use. However, we do have an alternative for you, and they showed us the land that we have described as the Prospect Ridge expansion, and they said, you know, we would be willing to swap that land for this. Now, why would that be designated? Why would that be necessary? Because that land over on Prospect Ridge is designated for recreation. So the town would need to approve the swap, obviously, and probably the state. It's not really clear at this point. So we're proposing this land swap for the available Prospect Ridge land. It may require local and or state approval, and Parks and Rec would like input into the footprint, into the access to the property, and several other concerns that they have. However, they are supportive of this proposal.
Have you talked to the Parks and Rec Commission about it?
Yes, we have. I'm going to get to that right now. So we've had informal conversations with Inland Wetlands, with the chair of Inland Wetlands, and we were told that a 100-foot upland review is required and water management plan is required. This is something that would be addressed in the feasibility phase, but she saw no immediate issues or red flags that said we should not go into a feasibility phase. We talked to the chair of WPCA. She said that with the reconstruction of the plant, the capacity will exist. She saw this, speaking for herself, as a suitable use of the capacity that exists, and there were no red flags. And we talked to the chair and director at Parks and Rec, and they brought it up at their meeting last night, and they are still supportive of this land swap. Now, obviously, we would go to them officially and formally, all of them, but this was just to find out if there are any red flags or hurdles we need to jump over immediately.
Well, where are they thinking of a land swap? That confuses me.
Me too.
Well, the discussion was for the property at the Parks and Rec campus, the property that we had originally proposed building on, because that is not necessarily
property.
Sorry?
Well, it's town
Parks and Rec
all
property.
it's town property, but
It's town
Parks and
property,
Rec
and it's not currently designated as recreational.
Where is that property?
It's within the current walking trail.
Was that the red kind of oval you showed a couple of pages back?
Yes,
Yeah.
it was.
Can
There's
you
another,
go back?
of course,
David, I'm sorry.
Sure.
Can you go back to that? I want to see I missed the, because mine is black and white here. I can't see.
Yeah,
Okay,
it's
that's
easy to see on the screen.
Okay, so it's the round oval area, that's the area that you're looking at, or that's what you were going?
Approximately, yes. And we had created a proposal to build there, but at the request of Parks and Rec, we considered the property on Prospect Ridge instead.
It's
How
not
many
really a
units,
swamp.
how many units would you be able to, did you contemplate at Parks and Rec?
I don't remember exactly. I believe it was in the low 20s.
Low 20s.
Yeah, it was a.
Okay, and this is and this is like 150.
Yes, but it's a different property, and our goal is.
No, I understand. I understand. It's a different property. I'm just trying to understand where it might have been there. So that's actually then. That's kind of hard to see because I have it on my phone. But all right, go ahead. So you would swap that property. Well, what's the swap? I mean, they don't. Doesn't the town own both properties?
Yes, and the swap it's really nominal because Parks and Rec doesn't own the property. The town owns the property, but that land over at Prospect Ridge is designated recreational. Those two lots. So what we would do instead is designate this where the oval is, and perhaps the whole property is recreational because it is not currently designated as recreational, although it's being used as recreational.
If I may, David, just a little history on the Prospect Ridge property. When that property was purchased, it was purchased with federal and state funds. And prior to us doing anything other than recreational use would require, I believe Phil Kearns told me today, a DEP, Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, approval. And not that that would be difficult, but that was part of the agreement when we signed on for the funding. Originally, there was going to be on Prospect Ridge a new ball field. I think Barbara, you may remember that, or others may remember that, which is not needed now.
Right.
The only recreational use I can think of for that land as it exists is a ski jump because it has quite a pitch on it. And you know, the contours of the land are something that we would have to deal with, but according to people we spoke with last time we considered it, they thought it would not be an issue to development. It would just be a constraint on the number of units we can build.
And the cost.
Obviously, right, the site prep work.
The site cost would be pretty substantial.
Mm-hmm. Any more questions on this slide?
No.
No, not on this.
I just had, I was curious about the WPCA because I had not heard anything from it. I didn't realize it was just a conversation you had with, I guess, Amy, the chair, but
Right.
Just digging a tiny bit today, it sounded to me like if there was any kind of usage there, it would need pumping to go down Governor Street, that it wouldn't, the Quail Ridge pump plant would not be viable, and nor would the Roland Lane. So that would add another considerable amount of cost to the project as well.
I'm trying to remember back to when the meadows were built, but I think we were able to tap into a connection just a little north of there. So I'm not sure what the solution would be, but I mean, that's why we want to do the feasibility work.
Right,
Yeah.
and going back to the meadows, that's one of a big red flag that I have, is because that was so, I mean, there was just so many unfortunate economic issues with that project that I would never want to duplicate that again. And in my own, just the experience that I had, the short experience that I've had on the board with it.
Well, I don't think we would in the housing authority either.
Thank you.
I can assure you that lessons have been learned all around on that.
And that would be something that I'd have to see in writing and by the numbers before I could get behind anything.
Of course.
The Meadows, David, the Meadows ties in at a manhole right on Governor Street at the intersection with Prospect Ridge. But relative to the WPCA, one of the major problems down through there as it heads south toward East Ridge Middle School has been the number of wipes that are found and clogging the sewer, causing a surcharge. And I think, Frank, you may be aware of that. I know Diana has sent several letters and to the residents to be sure not to flush. But that's one thing that with this kind of a development, we need to be sure because you're going to be pumping wherever you go. And I think that could be an issue to Maureen's point. Just wanted to bring that up. Anyway, we're well, that's well down the road.
But a good public service announcements, and I can tell you this after a $500 plumbing bill, flushable wipes aren't.
No.
All right. So an interesting aspect of this is that this could get us to a new 8-30G moratorium. So we would need, they called housing unit equivalent points, equivalent to 2% of the number of housing units, which is roughly 9,000, we're estimating here. So the housing unit equivalents from completed projects since the last moratorium, we have 86.25. Now the Prospect Ridge expansion in a hypothetical distribution of housing types could deliver 243.75. Here's how I calculated that. 60 elderly units, this is for 150. You get, and I'm sorry, it was not 75. So my calculation might be a little bit off, but you get half a point for an elderly unit. But if 40% or less of the units are elderly, you get another half unit bonus. We would get 60 points for that. Family units at 80% of income, you get 1.5%. We get 1.5 points each. At 60% income limit, you get 2 points each. And at 40%, you get 2.5. Now, this is entirely hypothetical. And you get an additional 1/4 point for each 3-bedroom unit. Now, if this were to, in fact, be what we're built, that would take us way beyond what we need for the second moratorium. So there's an additional benefit there. And the good news is this is a lot of housing units, but it's 100% affordable. So what we would be asking from the town is to contribute the land and the land only. It would be funded through low-income housing tax credits, state and federal grants and consideration from private institutions and organizations, loans potentially. Building a funding strategy is part of the feasibility process. However, I think we can assure you at this point that we're not looking for any town contribution beyond land. Now,
what about pilot?
Well, a pilot would be negotiated or applied, I assume.
Okay.
I think
because right now you're not paying the pilot on the meadows.
Right. I think
It's a $33,000 a year hit that the taxpayers are taking. So I'm a little concerned about, you're saying that there's no cost to the taxpayers right now, but once this is up, there could be a cost in terms of lost tax revenue, plus the additional cost of the various services that are required for a low income tax credit program. I have another question though, or a couple of questions. First of all, Rudy, since this is town property, will this require a town hall meeting?
Yes.
Okay. And then you do need to have deep approval before you go any further.
With the land use, yes. That's what Phil Kurtz told me. I have not researched it, Bob.
Okay, thank you. And David, can you tell me how this, we have this draft proposed legislation that's going to be introduced, or I believe it'll be put on the agenda in Hartford in January, with the elimination of single family zoning within a 1/4 mile of downtown. What kind of impact do you think that's going to have on, with a project like this and elsewhere within the town limits? Are you contemplating, because there's there's a possibility, I shouldn't say a likelihood, but there's a possibility of having a great deal more affordable housing that builders will be able to come in and add anywhere within the quarter mile of the downtown business district, or a half a mile of the basically of the train station. And then we also, of course, have the potential of the Danbury Housing Authority, or any housing authority for that matter, that can go 15 miles within the town. So basically, Danbury could bring an affordable housing application into 15 miles into Ridgefield. So I'm a little concerned about have you had any discussions or thoughts about that as to how many additional housing units can be brought in, and the types of affordable housing?
Well, I think you're referring to Representative Anwar's.
I'm referring to what they're referring to is desegregate Connecticut. That's correct.
Well, no,
Senator Arlen.
Desegregate Connecticut is a separate organization. They have their own agenda, but I think you're talking about
the bills that was presented by,
right.
By
and
Anwar.
that bill, it didn't go anywhere last time it was introduced. There's no reason to believe it will go somewhere this time. I think this is not, that's not a consideration for this project, for sure. However, the impact of this project on the town is something that would be specifically considered. And if you want, I can explain to you in the next slide, how the feasibility study would work.
I'm sorry, can I ask, Bob, was your question more about the demand if say that a bill did pass and then other, buildings, affordable housing units come in, is the question one of demand if all that happens, or is there something else, Bob?
Well, no, I think part of it is demand, Sean. But the other part is, I think again, I'm a little hesitant to move too quickly on this until we know what's going to happen with that bill. Because we could end up with, as David had said, there's an enormous demand for affordable housing. And, we can have a separate discussion on that. I don't want to take up tonight about it, but we have talked about this in the past. What are the different types of affordable housing? I remember one time when we were looking at various, condominium projects that were going to be approved, someone had suggested, well, affordable is 400,000 in Ridgefield. Here we're talking 40% of the area median income, or 60% of the area median income. And when we get to that type of housing, plus the other thing is, I don't know what the answer is, but with 830G, you're talking about these points that we will get, that we will qualify for the moratorium. I guess the other concern that I would have is we may get we may achieve enough points to get another moratorium for a few years. But if this other bill passes, that's not going to we're not going to get a moratorium from that, because that will actually be a change to our zoning. So we could end up theoretically, with a great deal of affordable housing within Ridgefield, within the downtown district of Ridgefield. And I think that's something that we need to really get a better understanding of, study, and take a deep dive into it before because I think we have some very serious concerns here.
I hear what you're saying, Bob. This is Rudy, but there is no bill that's been submitted at this point. Not that
I understand. No, you're right. There's not, but there is proposed draft legislation. Go ahead.
There is no bill submitted at this point, but we need to look at Ridgefield and how we are moving forward, understanding that the what ifs that exist in the world today. If we do have the moratorium, it would prevent any other applications technically for several years with this kind of a project. And it's not bad to have a plan on our books relative to, which is required, I believe, by state statute, to have a plan on how we're going to address affordable housing. And I think Planning and Zoning Commission has looked at that. Charles Robbins is on tonight for the Main Street plan, and I don't expect him to answer that. But, I don't think we should reject this out of hand because of what might happen in this session. This makes some sense for us as Ridgefield. Now, granted, if the state turns around and force feeds us something like that, maybe all bets are off and we need to adjust our trajectory. But at this point in time, I think it's a little premature to make a decision based on the possibility of what may happen in Hartford. That's just my 2 cents. That's all.
The other question I have is, location. I understand that, you're looking at land swap and that type of thing. But for many discussions that we've had, we've talked about having it's beneficial for affordable housing to be near a transit hub. And I'm just curious if you had looked at all at the, in the Branchville area where we had talked about the possibility of putting units up because of the proximity to the train station and, transportation.
Well, yeah, thank you for mentioning that. There is a proposal for affordable housing for transit-oriented development that came out of an 18-month study. I participated on the task force in that, and it was a very elaborate, well thought out plan that was led by Fitzgerald Halliday, and that plan has sat on the shelf at the Planning and Zoning Commission. One of the concerns there, of course, is there is no immediate access to septic capacity. But there's no reason that we couldn't do both. And since the land around this train station is privately owned, we don't have town land that we could build on there unless you want to remove a ball field, and I don't think we do. But what that does is create zoning incentives for people, private landowners, to build higher density near the train station. And that's something that the state supports and a lot of housing advocates support. This is separate from that. And the smart growth principle is that density of the kind that we're talking about should be basically constrained to the downtown, to services, to shops, and so on. And this is an ideal location for that. We're putting it right downtown.
Okay.
But how many of the units are for seniors, Dave? You went through that once. It's not in my.
Well, let me go to the next slide if you don't mind, because we're going to get to that.
Okay.
Can I move on? Is it okay?
Yep.
Great. So we will need a feasibility study, but this feasibility study would be funded by the Department of Housing through a grant to the tune of $30,000 to $50,000. We've met with the Department of Housing. They are introducing this grant program for just this kind of proposition, and they're willing to use us as a pilot for the grant program, which would be great. There would be engineering studies to evaluate the site. There would be a market study to determine the distribution of housing types. So Rudy, that's where we would answer the question of, how many elderly units do we need? How many do we need at 60, 80, 40, and so on? What needs do we have for people with disabilities? And then that would all go into developing a pro forma together with the funding sources to really find out what our economic feasibility is. And that, I think, is where we can answer with some degree of certitude how this will work without opening the door to any kind of economic issues like happened with the Meadows.
Yeah, if I may jump in there, Dave. One of the issues that we had with Meadows, one, it was a 20-unit standalone development, all of one type of housing, and all very much restricted rents. What we've gotten to in the rest of the housing authority, the other 132 units, Congregate is a difficult situation because of the building. Operationally, it's pretty good. Ballard Green is operationally okay. but no great shakes because rents are so low. And what makes the difference is the number of the general affordable units that we have. It makes the property much more viable and self-sustaining. And that's going to have to be one of the considerations, together with what the market demand is, to say, as opposed to the example that Dave shared with us, to say, do we need some of these, not necessarily market rate apartments, but programs that are closer to market rate that would provide more viability. The other thing that we have that perhaps the Housing Authority did not have at the time of Meadows is we have a history of financial data that's accurate and that has helped us to determine the path forward to viability. And that really didn't exist back then. Even before the management company was brought in, it was not a very professionally run kind of financial thing. Whereas now we have a lot of history that says, depending on the type of housing you have, here's what you're going to spend on almost anything you can think about based on our history. And we have a lot of that. And the other considerations are, of course, how big a mortgage you take. You know, if you get more grants, in the case of the rest of the Housing Authority, the limited partner piece, they did get a lot of grants that held down the cost of the mortgage. But it's a lot of pieces coming together from a kind of a financial and an operational flow basis, as well as from a market consideration.
But Frank, to the point of the mortgage, the size of the mortgage that you're looking for tied to the amount of the grants that you're getting, doesn't some of the grant money that you receive preclude the amount of dollars you can charge for the units? I mean, aren't there certain restrictions that might be placed because of the nature of the grant that you've applied for and you're using?
It's a competitive system for the most part within the state, and you're given various points, if you will, in a system not unlike the one Dave talked about for the 830G, but a different basis that says, okay, there are 15 towns that want money for housing in Connecticut. Now let's rate them all on a point basis. And the ones who get more points will get the money. The ones who get less won't. And what I understand, I've not been through it, but in talking to some of the consultants, it is a very competitive process. So in answer to your question, yes, it all plays a part.
Because we could be getting money from a grant that would not allow us to charge a fair market rent that we might need in order to improve the viability of the entire project.
It's a fine line, I agree, but our experience has shown that you need some of that higher rental stuff to balance the portfolio. And the work we'll do will determine if we can go down, if we can get to a point of saying, together with the construction costs that Bob mentioned, as well as the kind of mix of properties we want, if we can do all those things, make it financially viable, and at the same time qualify for the funding that we need to make it work. It's all kind of tied together.
It's a
David,
lot of questions.
Yeah, David, you talked about the 60 elderly, the family affordable housing at 80% of income, 60%, 40%, and then the various points associated with it in order to qualify for the the moratorium. Is there any? Do you have any? Because you can get additional points if we have a category for homeless as well. Do you contemplate any of that in there? And is there a need for that at this point?
There's probably a need. There's certainly a homelessness problem, but that's generally more of a supported housing, and we have not discussed this as supported housing at the moment. However, that's something we might be open to. This is where the feasibility phase will take us. That allocation that I presented was hypothetical for the purpose of identifying whether a project like this would get us to the next moratorium.
Okay. But are there any other than the elderly, 80, 60, 40, and homeless? Are there any other categories that may be considered in that? Or
Not
we have
really.
them pretty well covered?
Yeah, and we're talking rental. There's a very slightly different formula for ownership, but we're talking about rentals.
Okay.
And the last aspect of the feasibility study would be an impact analysis. Obviously, we want to know what the economic effect would be, what the effect on schools would be, what would be the effect on town services and infrastructure. And that's something that would all be determined in the feasibility study. And at the end of the feasibility phase, we would know whether we have a project we can proceed with. The next steps would be assent from the Board of Selectmen to apply for a feasibility grant. So at this point, we're not asking for the land, but we're obviously asking with the understanding that if the project is feasible, that it's something you would be likely to approve. We would apply for and receive the grant, anticipated sometime early in 21. The feasibility study, including any land use issues, partner selection and pre-development work, and only then would we begin the development process. So, as you know, this kind of thing takes a great deal of time. And we're at the very beginning.
Okay. So is this something, Frank, because you're on the line here, is this something that you see that when will the housing authority, well, I'm assuming that the housing authority will be involved in this. This would come under the, after it's completed, the housing authority would manage this like you do the other 152 units. Is that a correct assumption?
That's, I think, a distinct possibility. There are other alternatives in terms of management companies. And, you know, I, as a resident of Ridgefield, would expect our little group to determine what those other alternatives are and if they're feasible. But are we willing and able to step up to the plate? Yes, we are.
Okay, so tonight, what you're asking for is strictly the okay to apply for the grant with no implied subsequent approvals?
No implied subsequent approval, but the understanding that, I guess it's with an understanding of good faith that if this is feasible, as far as you understand feasibility, that this is a project that you would want to proceed with for the town.
So Rudy, I'd like to weigh in then at this point, because I asked the question earlier, you know, since this is town property, this will have to go to the town.
Right.
And I think for us to, or for me, at least as a selectman, I think I'd like to have the town weigh in on this and give us their input as to whether, you know, they would give us the implied approval to go ahead with this going forward.
Bob, how can anyone make a decision? We don't have any numbers. I mean,
Yeah,
we have no, it's like.
Well, we're not talking about the numbers. We're talking about, you know, Maureen, we're talking about the idea of putting 150 up to 150 units here. And is that something that the town, you know, townspeople are willing to have us consider? Regardless of the numbers, of course, we're not going to move forward with it if, you know, the numbers don't work. You can't put the capital stack together. There's a lot of issues where I know we're at the very beginning of it. But what we're talking about is, you know, with the implied consent, that if all that makes sense, we're going to vote in favor of it. And I, for one, and I'm only one vote, I'm not so sure I'm in favor of that right now. And I'd like to have the town weigh in on whether or not at a town hall meeting, whether this is something we should do. I'm just one person, one vote.
Yeah, I guess my question is, so, you know, in a sense, you're absolutely right, or absolutely agree that we need input from the town. I guess my question is, when is the appropriate time to get that input? It would seem like having done a feasibility study would give people more information to be able to, have an informed opinion about what that is going forward.
Yeah, David, would the feasibility study include traffic analysis, et cetera?
Yes, absolutely.
That would be a concern for the neighbors in and around that area. And the traffic that we see on East Ridge now during the weekdays, like between 3 and 6, is really backing up. And to add to that, we would want to know what the potential impact could be. That's just one thing we need to have information about. So the feasibility study would, in fact, give us that information, correct?
Absolutely.
And to Bob's point, I mean, I think in a lot of ways he is right. We should hear if people seriously would consider or want to see 150 units, behind the dog park. And in that regard, if we did go forward to say, yes, a feasibility study is needed so we can make an informed decision, I, for one, would not want anyone to take that as an implication that I'm in favor of doing this. I'd say, I think knowledge is best. And if we had the work done and you have a grant that you can come back with numbers and tell us that it's not going to turn out to be another Meadows and the traffic isn't going to be horrendous and the sewer won't cost you a lot of money, and the fact that it's going to be, you think that it should be a ski slope instead of a field, but you still plan on building 150 units on there. If that's what you want to spend your grant money on, then, and that's what you can get a grant for, I understand. But I would not take that as far as my vote, that this is a go ahead, that I'm in favor of this right now.
And where is this grant money coming from? Is this private funds, or where's that coming from?
Department of Housing.
Okay, so it's taxpayer money.
David, federal or state?
Grant would be to the town.
Right.
Is it federal or state money?
It's state money.
State
And
money,
this is,
I thought.
when we presented this to the Department of Housing, they were very enthusiastic because this is exactly the kind of development that they want to see. So they were very supportive, and that's when they offered us this pilot grant.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I haven't said anything. I've been listening. I think it makes sense to do the feasibility study, but I don't think, Dave, that you should put words into our mouth by saying that this is an assumption that if the feasibility study comes back saying that this is something feasible, that we will necessarily support going ahead, because as Rudy said, there are going to be traffic considerations. There are going to be all kinds of issues that may come up that may make it feasible, but may not make it desirable for Ridgefield. I'm not saying that's going to be the case. And I really believe we should do the feasibility study. But because we do need more affordable housing, there's no question about that. But I don't want anything to be assumed for granted.
No, of course not. And we wouldn't take that for granted. I guess what I'm asking is, we want to make sure before we go ahead with the feasibility work that this is the kind of thing we want to do. Obviously, it's up to you as the selectman to set the bar for feasibility wherever you want. But I guess what I'm asking is this the kind of thing we want to do? And if it's the kind of thing we want to do, then we should go determine the feasibility. If it's not the kind of thing we want to do, then there's really no point in determining the feasibility of it.
David, that's well said. And each of us is I'm one of 5 people. We each can have our own opinions and views on it. And that's why I think it's important to have the residents weigh in on it. So I'll be very, frank right now. For me personally, I don't think 150 unit high rise, development is what I would like to see in Ridgefield. So I would be voting, no to it, because that's not what I want. However, this is something that I'm only, we represent 25,000 people, or 19,000, voters. I think we need to hear from them to see, what the general consensus is as to what they want. That's the only place I'm coming. And if that's what the town wants, then I would be supportive and I would vote in favor of going forward with the feasibility study. But I'm not comfortable personally to making that decision to say that, yes, this is, what the town wants.
Can
Just-
I
sorry.
pop in for a second? Because I have a question, because maybe I missed something. You're not talking about a single structure with 150 apartments in it.
No, we didn't suggest high rise. In fact, our 2012 proposal was mostly low rise, single story units.
Okay, I mean, I wanted to clarify that because Bob just said high rise and that was a word out of.
But 150
Out of
single
ether.
story units is still a lot of units, Barbara.
Oh, I'm not saying it isn't, Maureen. I'm not saying, but it's very different than a
Absolutely.
high rise apartment building.
Well, how many acres is this? 1.5 acres.
Well,
15 acres.
Oh, 15 acres. I'm sorry, 15 acres. Okay, my apology.
Yeah, we'd have to put a pretty big tower to get it.
Yeah,
1.5
yeah,
acres.
to get 150 units on there.
Well, I'll go back to what Maureen said, and I don't disagree with Bob in that, yes, the people need to be involved in making a decision about the future of our community, whether this is a good project there or not. But as Maureen stated, people are going to have a lot of questions, and if we don't have any answers for them, that town meeting, public hearing, whatever we want to do, won't be very productive at all in terms of, and I can hear people getting upset that, well, how come you don't have any of these answers? So I think a feasibility study without any implied conclusion is something that we may want to move forward with. So I would support it with that understanding that once we collect this information, then we can have something to bring to the public to say, what are your feelings about this?
And that's exactly where I was, right? I think we need to have the study to be able to, answer some of those questions. Again, the idea of 150, that maybe seems like a lot, especially given the way the land is, but I don't know. We certainly don't have enough information now to say whether that's the right thing or not. But to me, at least, there's a very clear need for this kind of housing. You could see, I was blown away, Dave, by the numbers you showed with the waiting lists for those different types of housing. And, looking at demographics, that's not getting smaller. That demand is only going to get bigger. So, and again, maybe it doesn't look exactly like that 150, but I would definitely support at least doing the feasibility study. And that's why you do it, to see if it's feasible. And maybe it is, and maybe it isn't.
to the
Well,
point that
we do have a concept of what the project would consist of. Up to approximately 150 units, 60% 60 units elderly, and then the balance of family affordable with the various income limitations. So, I mean, that's and I'd like to go. And these vacancy numbers or the waiting list numbers. I'd like to ask Frank to address that, because I'm not up to date on it. My understanding has been the town has always had a number of, this is not terribly unusual. We have a number of people on the waiting list, but given the type of housing that we have, some years that waiting list clears up pretty quickly, and other years, people, very few people move. So if I'm not mistaken, this waiting list, there's people that are on there for several years. And when we call them, when a vacancy does come up and you call them, you may go through 10, 20 people before you get to one that's is ready and able and willing to move. So Frank, how do you know how dated? I mean, how many? Just roughly speaking, how far back does our waiting list go in terms of the number of years? And then what is the how many units do we have available? And then how quickly are they filled?
Well, my experience is of course similar to yours, Bob. In terms of in the past, the management team was very effective at qualifying the top of the waiting list. So we had turnarounds in terms of the amount of time an apartment would be vacant in the 1 to 2 day period, which is extraordinarily good. We've had a change in management. So I think what we're seeing right now is some problems from that change. So we have had some vacancies, and we've had some that went fairly long. And I think it's more a management issue than it is a demand. In the case of the Ballard Green, our least expensive apartments, there's no excuse for those not being refilled immediately. And I believe the demand for those goes many years. The general affordable are more expensive, but they're very competitive compared to market rates. And the turnover there is extraordinarily low, much lower than at Ballard Green. So it depends a bit on the property, and I'm sorry if I'm going too long on this. I think you have to have effective management, but effective management will make the demand there. I mean, a waiting list of 1 to 2 years in most of these properties is good. In the case of the family units, we've seen that waiting list dry up very rapidly when there's been big turnover. This year, there's been almost no turnover there. I don't think any turnover. So Congregate, the 4th program, it has had turnover, and it's far more expensive than the other properties. It provides more services and meals and so forth. But it's also much more heavily subsidized than any of the other properties. And the state funding is continued there. But as near as I can tell, Bob, it's a management problem, and the demand is significant, especially in the case of Ballard, when you throw in the adults with disabilities who can move in there. I mean, I think we all know people who have been on a waiting list at Ballard for more than 2 years and haven't been called. And so there's no excuse for, in my mind, not to have vacancies. We have a few now, but I think it's a management issue as opposed to a demand question.
Yeah.
Okay, and then the you brought up another good point there, Frank. Excuse me. Yeah, we've seen cuts from state funding or subsidies over the years, correct? I mean, especially this past year. Yeah.
New Ballard residents are not subsidized.
Okay, will these new units, are they proposed? Will they be subsidized? And
It depends on the type of program we go. I would think probably not. I mean, I don't know the answer to your question, but I suspect not, because we're not going to go the congregate model, and that's the most well-funded one.
Okay.
But the rates will be low enough to still be very attractive.
Maureen, you had a question?
No, I'm good right now, Rudy. Thank you.
I saw you raise your hand before. Bob, did you want to follow up?
No, I think I'm good for right now.
Barbara?
No, I think, Rudy, I would support a feasibility study because I do think there are a lot of unanswered questions. I think there is a need. It may not be for 150 units of the kind that Dave is talking about. It may be for something less or even something more. But I think it deserves study because there are a lot of people in the area who work in town, who could still not afford to live in town. I think we need, we have a wonderful town, and I think we need to share it a little.
Thank you. Sean?
Yeah, so I'm definitely in support of that. Again, as I said before, I think there's an incredible need for this. I think the demand is just going to grow higher over time. I think it's something we should study. And again, there's certainly possibilities that things come up that suggest this is not right for Ridgefield. That's fine, but we need to understand it. And so I'd be supportive of feasibility study.
And Maureen, go ahead.
Well, as I said, I think that we need to have a feasibility study, but that is as for me, it's not, I don't want anyone putting words in my mouth or my vote and saying that then in all likelihood, I'm going to be supporting this, because I want all the numbers. I want all of the information. I want to have the town's input. I am not in any way voting to support this project right now. I would be voting to support a feasibility study. And the second thing I would want, and I had said it at the beginning, and Frank jumped right in because he knew what I was saying. I would definitely want to see numbers that would show me that this project would not end up the way the Meadows did, and would in any way cause the kind of financial implications that the Meadows has caused. And because I just don't think that would be fair to the taxpayers.
Thank you. And then Bob, you had already stated your feelings, but do you want any last minute?
Yeah, I'll make one last comment. Okay, understand that this is a feasibility study for a particular idea, particular concept, a particular project. Okay, I had been in favor for years of looking at a affordable housing study. This is a feasibility study for this project. And for that reason, until I get feedback from the town, I will not support I will vote no in this case.
And I just want to be clear that this is an application to apply for the funding to do a feasibility
to do a feasibility study based on the presentation that David had given us.
Well, I think the feasibility study will begin from ground zero and see what they can develop out of that. I don't think there are any implied, and that's the whole point of this discussion, is that we don't want anything to be implied, whether it's 150 or 15 units. That is what they would like to see, but I think that's a lot of units, and I agree with some of the comments relative to the number of units. David, prior to our vote?
I just want to say that the 150 units came by applying a number of 10 units per acre, which is a moderate multifamily number. So it's entirely hypothetical, and it would be determined by the feasibility study what we could and should put in.
Right. Okay. So I'll entertain a motion. Would someone like to make a motion?
I'm happy to make the motion for the feasibility study.
And I'm happy to second it.
Okay, so the motion is to approve the submission of an application for a grant from the Department of Housing to conduct a feasibility study for this particular property, keeping in mind that there are absolutely no implied results or anything that we're looking at, other than this. We just want to look at that to have information for the people so that we can bring it to a public hearing at that point.
Right.
Okay, Barbara, you seconded that?
Yes.
Okay, motion made and seconded. Any further debate? There being none, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed?
I oppose.
Okay. Motion carries 4-1. Thank you, David, and thank you, Frank, for being patient tonight. I appreciate your hanging in there.
Thank you for your time.
Yes, thank you very much for your time.
Yep. Thank you, David. Appreciate
Thank
your
you
effort.
for all your work.
Okay, we'll move on to next.